the amendment be agreed to. And before I call the member for Bendigo, I'd just like to acknowledge her supportive comments of the coalition unification. I call the member for Bendigo.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Debacle is the only word you can use to describe the government's performance on this issue. Let's just remember it was their tax that they introduced in the 2015 budget. It was their decision to tax backpackers 32.5% for every dollar that they earn. Their decision. Their decision. And instantly it was unpopular with their constituency. And can I take a moment to say it was also, and it might shock the coalition, it was also instantly unpopular with our unions. They were not happy that we had decided to adopt that position because they argued it was an issue of fairness, Deputy Speaker. So perhaps the government might want to check out their submissions from the unions about what they argued in relation to the 32.5%. So the government went for a quick tax grab. It went through the parliament and it's been sitting there. And since then, within the coalition, they've not been able to resolve this issue until just recently. Yet they seek to blame everybody but themselves for their unhappy marriage and their inability to resolve this issue. So what we have before us is dropping the tax to 19%. It's still a tax, and let's not pretend that it's not. You're still taxing backpackers 19%. Some of the language and the rhetoric in the media suggests that it's almost dropped off entirely. Not true. It is still at 19%, which is less than 32.5%, but it is still 19%. And you have to ask the question, why 19%? Why is it that? And that's one of the reasons why this side is referring it to a committee, because it's such a random figure. There's no other tax rate of 19%. Yes, it's just they've put it out there in terms of economics, but you cannot trust this government when it comes to economics. This needs to be tested. And what we've seen on cue, as expected from government members, is a lot of alarmism. They're blaming the introduction of their own tax for the reason that backpackers are dropping off. They're saying their own tax is the reason why less backpackers are coming here. And, Deputy Speaker, that is a really simple proposition that they put forward, and they're not even acknowledging that it's their own fault if that is the sole reason why backpacker numbers are dropping. But the truth is there are other reasons why the numbers are dropping. And the other reason why this bill needs to go to a Senate inquiry is because we need to look at some of those other reasons. We need to really explore why it is the other parts of this package have been put forward. I'm not surprised that members opposite are not referring to the Fair Work Ombudsman report that was released over the weekend. It was a pretty damning report of the backpacker visa, the 417 visas and the 462 visas, and what was released. This particular report found that a third of backpackers that they surveyed are being underpaid. Perhaps the reason why backpacker numbers are dropping is because they're being exploited. Something that the government is choosing to ignore, something that the government is running away from, is genuine, significant reform on the exploitation of backpackers in our country. I'm not surprised, but I am disappointed that the government is not acknowledging that this could be a reason why backpackers are dropping off. Farm work is hard work. There's no denying that. Farm work is very hard work. It's regional, it's remote, it's hard to get to, and our farmers are in competition with so many other industries when it comes to backpacker labour. And something that the government is also not acknowledging in this debate is that whilst we have about 200,000 backpackers in this country at the moment, only about 38,000 of them ever step foot onto a farm. So for all of their ranting that we need to push through with this right now to get the harvest off the trees, right now because this is the vital labour that is working on our farms, what they're not acknowledging is that it's also about the 160,000 people that will never step foot onto a farm. What they're not acknowledging is that with the backpacker visa, you can work anywhere in our country. It is uncapped. They are directly competing against young job seekers. And just some example about where some of these backpackers are working. They're working in mining, they're working in construction, they're working in beauty, they're even working as social workers, Deputy Speaker. And you would think that backpackers as social workers is a bad policy decision and direction to be going down. And we're talking about social workers who deal with some of our most vulnerable children, foster children, and we have backpackers working as social workers, Deputy Speaker, social workers. Originally, and it is so important in this debate that we acknowledge the original intent of the backpacker visa. In 1975, it was introduced by the Australian government, the working holiday visa, as a cultural exchange program. It was an opportunity to foster closer cultural ties with other countries. And so young Australians could go over there and their young people could come here. In 2005, under the Howard government, the new option was introduced, allowing 417 visas a chance to stay for a second year. And this is where we saw the backpacker visa become a labour supply visa. And this is where the government back then, and we're seeing the repercussions of that a decade on, created some significant problems. The second year, and this is what was exposed in the Fair Work Ombudsman's report that was released on the weekend, the fact that the 88 days, you have to perform those 88 days to get the second visa. It has created a culture of exploitation. Today, the backpacker visa is becoming a cultural exchange of exploitation. That is what came out in the report released on the weekend. A third of backpackers not being paid their correct entitlements. We're not talking about a handful of backpackers here. We're talking about a third of backpackers that they'd surveyed. We're talking about people working on the 88 days having to pay for the opportunity to work to get their visa extended. Let's just explore and expose the sham that has become this visa, which this government doesn't want to talk about. They're only trying to do a band-aid solution. Let's just fix the tax and that'll turn backpacker numbers around. You're kidding yourself if you think by lowering the tax rate you will fix our international reputation. Other countries are upset that their young people are being exploited by Australian businesses. And it was evident in the Fair Work Ombudsman's report. They actually spoke to consulars that are here in Australia. It has been raised time and time again about the treatment of their young nationals in our country by Australian employers and Australian industry. What the report also found, which the government have not acknowledged, not only that a third claimed that they were paid less than the minimum rate, they also found that they were forced to work excessive hours, they were being sexually abused, and that working and living in unsafe conditions. It goes into detail how some employers deducted from their pay without even asking for their permission. It goes into detail how they were forced to stay in substandard living arrangements and then taken out of their pay. There is an ugly underbelly when it comes to this visa. Yet the government doesn't want to talk about that in their package of reforms. It's really frustrating that the only thing that we've really got to debate today is about the tax measure. What is not before us that the government should be focusing on is cleaning up this visa. Instead, what we have seen from the government, rather than measures to clean up the seedy underbelly and the exploitation associated with this visa, is the government wants to expand the eligibility up to 35. But young Australians can't do that. Young Australians can't go work in the UK up to 35. Young Australians can't go to Canada and work up to 35. The original intent of this was a cultural exchange. What impact expanding the eligibility up to 35 will that have on our jobs market? These are the questions that need to be asked. Working for the same employer in two locations, how will that help our ag industry that the government so much cares about? You know, what it really means is that people, employers in hospitality, employers in construction, employers in mining, the bigger firms that we have out there, they will simply move backpackers around, making it even harder and harder for the agricultural industry to attract the workers they so desperately need. Deputy Speaker, the government is simply ignoring the fact that it is not just the tax why backpackers are choosing not to come to this country. Conditions in their own country have improved. The treatment of backpackers in this country has to be a factor. The industry has to embrace reform. If you exploit backpackers, if you treat them appallingly, people will stop working here. They will stop taking up that cultural exchange, because who wants a cultural exchange of exploitation? And I encourage members of the government to read this report and see the failings of their own minister to clean this up. The Minister for Employment, the Minister for Immigration are doing nothing to clean up the exploitation of vulnerable backpackers in our country. One of the reasons why it is so hard for farmers to attract people into agriculture, and reiterate the facts, about 200,000 backpackers in our country, and AusVeg themselves identified about 38,000 that work on farms. It's because they are in competition with a number of other industries, including meatworks. So an example in my electorate which saw local workers displaced, Don KR, big employer, 1,500 people. In the lead up to Christmas, local casuals would get extra work. It would help them through the Christmas period. Castlemaine is a town of 6,000. What Don KR did was said, OK, we're going to use a labour hire firm with Taiwanese backpackers. We now know that they've been engaged in some of the practices exposed in the Fair Work Ombudsman's report, and basically Don KR turned around and said they're cheaper. They said it in the local media. They're cheaper than Australian workers, so we're going with the backpackers. 200 jobs lost locally. Now, I'm sure that there's a farmer with some fruit that would rather have those 200 backpackers up there, but this is the competition that they're in. The government has failed to do proper labour market testing, labour market analysis about where backpackers are working. They're up here ranting with this huff and puff about why we need to drop the tax to get backpackers in to pick fruit, when majority of backpackers will never walk onto a farm. Another example, Deputy Speaker, is about backpackers. They're increasingly being used in construction and in mining. And you must acknowledge during this debate, and not one member across has, the unsafe workplaces that some of our backpackers in construction are working in. You know, my Facebook, I've had the haunting image of that young German backpacker that was here, her smiling face, here for a cultural exchange, when last Monday she tragically lost her life. 27-year-old backpacker fell to her death. She fell down a 35-metre shaft to her death on a Perth construction site. She's also somebody who works for a company who has underpaid workers, substandard working conditions. This is on the back of 2 young Irish construction workers who were crushed and killed 12 months ago. One of the most dangerous places to be employed, it appears, is being a backpacker working on a construction site, a backpacker working in a farm industry. What the government is not doing is ensuring that these guest workers in our country, that their employers have the proper health and safety in place and in check. The intersection between labour hire and how they are treating backpackers needs to be explored, which is why we have suggested that this go off to a Senate inquiry to be reviewed. Deputy Speaker, there's a lot that's in the package that the minister is responsible for that we will not get the chance to debate, which is why it's necessary for it to go off to a Senate inquiry to ask the questions. The 19%, an arbitrary figure. It is rich of the government to stand here and say, don't worry, we've balanced the books, it will all work out. You cannot trust this government when it comes to economic figures. You cannot trust this government when it comes to economics. You also need to call them on the ranting and raving that if we don't do this right now, the harvest will not get picked. It is their own fault and their own making. We need to explore the impact that backpacker labour is having on our jobs in our industries. We need to explore that. It needs to be called out for what it is. We need to ensure that every worker in this country, whether they be on a farm, whether they be an Australian or a backpacker, whether they be in construction, whether they be at Don KR, whether they be at any number of places, are paid appropriate wages and are treated with respect and dignity and, quite frankly, go home at the end of the day. The cultural exchange for the young German backpacker, the 2 Irish backpackers, and anyone else who's had a horrible experience through our backpacker visa program. That cultural exchange needs to end. This visa needs to get back to what was originally intended to do: to closer relations between two countries. It should not be used as a cheap source of labour that Australian industries use to undercut the wages and undercut the jobs of Australian workers.
I thank the honourable member